The morning sun cast long shadows across the Naval Amphibious Base Coronado as Sarah Chun adjusted the straps of her worn duffel bag. At 28, she looked younger than most recruits arriving for basic underwater demolition/SEAL training, her slight frame and quiet demeanor drawing curious glances from the other candidates gathering near the training compound entrance. She had deliberately chosen civilian clothes that made her appear unremarkable: faded jeans, a simple gray t-shirt, and scuffed sneakers that had seen better days. The other candidates were exactly what she expected: tall, muscular men in their early 20s, most sporting military haircuts, and the kind of confident swagger that came from years of being told they were the best. They clustered in small groups, comparing stories about their previous military service, their college football careers, or their impressive physical achievements. Their voices carried across the morning air, each trying to establish dominance before the training even began. "Look at that," muttered Jake Morrison, a former college linebacker whose massive shoulders strained against his polo shirt. He nodded toward Sarah as she quietly found a spot near the back of the group. Did someone's little sister get lost on her way to the mall? His comment drew chuckles from the men around him. Tommy Rodriguez, a former Marine who stood 6'3" and looked like he could bench press a small car, shook his head in disbelief. "I heard they were letting women try out now, but seriously? She looks like a strong breeze would knock her over." Sarah heard every word, but kept her expression neutral. She had spent the last 15 years perfecting the art of being underestimated, and it had served her well throughout her rapid rise through the Navy's ranks. As a Rear Admiral, she had commanded respect from admirals and generals around the world, but today she was just another recruit hoping to earn the coveted SEAL Trident. The idea for this undercover assignment had come from the Secretary of the Navy himself. Recent reports suggested that the culture within SEAL training needed evaluation, particularly regarding the integration of female candidates. Rather than sending in investigators who would change the dynamics simply by their presence, they had decided on a more unconventional approach. Sarah would go through the entire training process as a regular recruit, with only the base commander aware of her true identity. Her official record for this assignment showed her as Sarah Wilson, a former Navy hospital corpsman with a bachelor's degree in physical therapy. The background was solid enough to withstand casual scrutiny, but unremarkable enough to avoid drawing attention. She had spent months preparing physically, working with trainers who specialized in SEAL conditioning while carefully avoiding any exercises that might reveal her advanced combat training. "Attention!" The voice of Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Williams cut through the morning chatter like a knife. The assembled candidates immediately fell silent and attempted to form some semblance of a formation. Williams was a legend in the SEAL community, a 20-year veteran who had seen combat in every major conflict of the past 2 decades. His weathered face and steady gaze suggested he had forgotten more about warfare than most people would ever learn. "Welcome to basic underwater demolition/SEAL training," Williams announced, his voice carrying easily across the group without seeming to strain. "For the next 24 weeks, this place will be your home, your school, and your personal hell. Most of you will quit. Statistics say that roughly 75% of the men standing here today will ring that bell before graduation." He gestured toward a brass bell mounted on a post near the training office. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the rope hanging beside it, waiting for the moment when the pressure became too much and another candidate decided to walk away from the most challenging military training program in the world. "Some of you are here because you think being a SEAL will make you special," Williams continued, his eyes scanning the formation with the intensity of a predator evaluating potential prey. "Others think you're already special, and this training is just a formality. Both groups are wrong. This training doesn't make you special. It reveals who was already special and who was just pretending to be." Sarah noticed how his gaze lingered on her for just a moment longer than the others, but his expression revealed nothing. She wondered if he suspected something or if he was simply trying to gauge whether she would be the first to break under the psychological pressure that was already beginning to build. "Your first evolution begins in 15 minutes, Williams announced. "You will complete a physical screening test consisting of a 500-yard swim, maximum push-ups in 2 minutes, maximum sit-ups in 2 minutes, maximum pull-ups with no time limit, and a 1 and a half-mile run in boots and pants. The minimum standards are posted on the board behind me. Anyone who fails to meet these minimums will be dropped from the program immediately. The candidates began moving toward the testing area, their earlier bravado replaced by focused concentration. Sarah noticed that several of the men were stretching and going through elaborate warm-up routines, their movements precise and practiced. She did some basic stretches, careful not to demonstrate the advanced flexibility that came from years of specialized training. Jake Morrison positioned himself near Sarah as they walked toward the pool. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You might want to save yourself some embarrassment and ring that bell now. This isn't like swimming at the local YMCA. "Thanks for the advice," Sarah replied quietly, her voice neutral and unremarkable. She had learned long ago that responding to such comments with anger or defensiveness only encouraged more harassment. Better to let her performance speak for itself. The pool area was Olympic-sized and filled with the kind of crystal-clear water that revealed every movement beneath the surface. A group of instructors stood along the edges with stopwatches and clipboards, their faces showing the same professional detachment that Sarah had seen in evaluators throughout her career. The psychological pressure was deliberate. Knowing that every movement was being measured and judged added an extra layer of stress to what was already a challenging physical test. Williams called out, reading from his roster. "You're in the first group." Sarah nodded and moved toward the pool edge along with 9 other candidates. The men around her were going through final mental preparations, some closing their eyes in concentration while others stared at the water as if trying to will themselves to superior performance. She noticed that Jake Morrison had positioned himself in the lane next to hers, clearly intending to make some kind of statement about male superiority. "Swimmers, take your mark," announced one of the instructors, a petty officer whose own sealed trident gleamed in the morning sunlight. The candidates crouched at the pool edge, their muscles tense with anticipation. Sarah could feel the adrenaline beginning to flow through her system, but she forced herself to remain calm. This was just another test, and she had been taking tests her entire career. The starting signal echoed across the water, and 10 bodies dove into the pool simultaneously. Sarah's dive was clean but unremarkable, designed to get her into the water efficiently without drawing attention to the advanced techniques she had learned during her years of specialized training. She surfaced and began swimming with smooth, steady strokes that conserved energy while maintaining good speed. Jake Morrison was swimming in the lane beside her, his powerful arms churning through the water with the kind of raw strength that came from hours in the weight room. He was clearly pushing harder than necessary for a screening test, probably hoping to establish dominance early in the training cycle. Sarah matched his pace without apparent effort, her technique focused on efficiency rather than power. As they reached the halfway point of the swim, Sarah noticed that Jake was beginning to show signs of fatigue. His stroke rate was increasing, but his distance per stroke was decreasing, a classic sign that he was fighting the water rather than working with it. She maintained her steady rhythm, drawing on years of experience that had taught her the value of pacing in long-duration events. The final 100 yards saw Jake's lead beginning to evaporate as his technique deteriorated further. Sarah could have easily pulled ahead, but she maintained her position just slightly behind him, crossing the finish line with a time that was well within the acceptable range but not exceptional enough to draw unwanted attention. Her breathing was steady and controlled, showing none of the distress that was evident in some of the other candidates. "Nice swim, Wilson," called out Tommy Rodriguez as he pulled himself from the pool. "For a girl, anyway." The comment drew snickers from several nearby candidates, but Sarah simply nodded in acknowledgement. She had heard variations of that phrase throughout her career, and it no longer had the power to affect her emotionally. Instead, she used it as motivation, filing away another name on her mental list of people who would be surprised when the training revealed who she really was. The push-up test was next, and Sarah positioned herself on the concrete pad along with the other candidates. The surface was rough and warm from the morning sun, providing good grip, but promising to be uncomfortable during the extended exercise period. Around her, the men were settling into various starting positions, some preferring a wide grip, while others kept their hands closer together. "The exercise is the push-up," announced the instructor. The starting position is the front-leaning rest. Your body must remain straight from your ankles to your shoulders. Your chest must touch the deck on each repetition, and your arms must fully extend at the top. You have 2 minutes. Begin. Sarah began her repetitions with the same measured approach she had used in the swimming test. Her form was technically perfect, but not obviously superior to the other candidates. She had trained extensively for this moment, working with fitness specialists who had helped her develop the specific endurance needed for military-style testing while maintaining her cover as a former hospital corpsman. Around her, she could hear the grunts and heavy breathing that indicated maximum effort from the other candidates. Jake Morrison was counting out loud, his voice strained but determined as he pushed through repetition after repetition. Tommy Rodriguez was maintaining a faster pace, his Marine Corps background evident in his aggressive approach to the exercise. The instructors moved among the candidates like sharks, watching for form violations and calling out warnings to those whose technique was beginning to deteriorate under fatigue. "Lock your body," shouted one instructor to a candidate whose hips were sagging. "If I can slide a sheet of paper under your chest, it doesn't count." Sarah maintained her steady pace throughout the 2-minute period, finishing with a score that placed her solidly in the middle of the group. Several candidates had scores that were significantly higher, but she noticed that some of them were showing signs of the kind of exhaustion that would make the remaining tests more challenging. Her own breathing was elevated but controlled, and her muscles felt warm rather than burning. The sit-up test followed the same pattern, with Sarah performing well enough to avoid attention while conserving energy for the challenges ahead. The pull-up test was potentially more problematic, as her technique was significantly superior to what would be expected from her cover identity. She had spent weeks practicing a modified technique that would be effective but not obviously advanced. As she approached the pull-up bar, Jake Morrison was just finishing his set with an impressive display of upper body strength. 23, called out the instructor, marking his score on the clipboard. Jake dropped from the bar with a satisfied grin, flexing his shoulders as he walked away. Sarah gripped the bar with a standard overhand grip, hanging for a moment to ensure her body was properly aligned. The metal was cold against her palms, and she could feel the slight texture that would help maintain her grip as fatigue set in. Around her, the other candidates were watching with the kind of interest that came from knowing this would likely be where the female candidate would fail to meet standards. She began her repetitions with smooth, controlled movements that demonstrated good technique without revealing the advanced training that had developed her upper body strength far beyond what would be expected from her background. Each repetition was performed with her chin clearing the bar and her arms reaching full extension at the bottom, meeting the exacting standards that the instructors demanded. The count climbed steadily, 5, 10, 15, and Sarah could sense the growing surprise from the watching candidates. Her breathing remained controlled, and her movements showed no signs of the deteriorating form that typically marked the approach of failure. At 20 repetitions, she was still moving smoothly, though she began to add subtle signs of fatigue to her performance. She completed 25 repetitions before allowing her form to deteriorate enough that the next attempt failed to meet standards. As she dropped from the bar, she noticed the expressions of grudging respect from several nearby candidates, mixed with surprise that the quiet woman had outperformed half the men in the group. "Not bad, Wilson," Tommy Rodriguez admitted, though his tone suggested he was still skeptical about her overall capabilities. "Let's see how you do on the run." The 1.5 half-mile run was the final component of the physical screening test, and Sarah knew it would be the most challenging to manage properly. Running had always been one of her strongest areas, and her natural pace was significantly faster than what her cover identity should demonstrate. She had practiced extensively to develop a running style that would be effective but not exceptionally skilled. The course was a loop around the base that included several hills and varied terrain designed to test both speed and endurance. The candidates lined up at the starting line, most of them showing signs of fatigue from the previous tests but still determined to demonstrate their fitness levels. The morning sun had grown stronger, adding the challenge of heat management to the already demanding test. "This is a timed run," announced the instructor. "You will complete 1.5 miles in boots and pants. The maximum allowable time is posted on the board. Anyone who exceeds this time will be dropped from the program." Are there any questions? There were no questions, only the focused silence of athletes preparing for competition. Sarah checked her bootlaces one final time and settled into a ready position that was comfortable but not obviously professional. Around her, the other candidates were going through their own final preparations, some bouncing on their toes, while others stood perfectly still. The starting signal sent the group forward in a loose pack, with several candidates immediately pushing to the front in an apparent attempt to establish dominance. Sarah settled into the middle of the group, matching the pace while carefully monitoring her own effort level. The boots and pants added weight and restricted movement compared to running gear, but she had trained extensively in similar conditions. Jake Morrison had positioned himself near the front of the pack, his long strides eating up ground as he attempted to distance himself from the other candidates. Tommy Rodriguez was running beside him, the two large men setting a pace that was aggressive enough to challenge the rest of the group. Behind them, several other candidates were working hard to maintain contact with the leaders. Sarah found herself running alongside a quiet candidate named David Park, a former Army medic whose running form suggested good natural ability without extensive training. His breathing was steady and his pace consistent, making him an ideal pace setter for her purposes. She matched his stride and settled in for what she hoped would be an unremarkable finish. The first hill came at the half-mile mark, a gradual climb that tested the aerobic conditioning of the entire group. Sarah could see the leaders beginning to show signs of their aggressive early pace, their form becoming less efficient as fatigue began to accumulate. She maintained her steady effort, allowing her natural fitness to carry her up the hill without the visible strain that was affecting some of the other candidates. As they crested the hill, Sarah noticed that the pack was beginning to spread out significantly. Jake Morrison was still in the lead, but his margin was smaller and his breathing was becoming labored. Tommy Rodriguez had fallen back slightly, though he was still running strongly. Behind them, the rest of the group was strung out over several hundred yards. The downhill section that followed the climb was where Sarah had to be most careful. Her natural inclination was to use gravity to increase her pace and make up time, but that would demonstrate a level of tactical running knowledge that didn't fit her cover story. Instead, she maintained her steady effort and allowed the runners with less experience to pull ahead as they fought against gravity rather than working with it. The final half-mile was flat and straight, providing a clear view of the finish line and the instructors waiting with their stopwatches. Sarah could see that Jake Morrison was still in the lead, but his form had deteriorated significantly, and he was clearly struggling to maintain his pace. Several other candidates had closed the gap and were positioning themselves for final kicks to the finish. Sarah maintained her position in the middle of the pack, crossing the finish line with a time that was well within the required standard but not fast enough to draw attention. Her breathing was elevated but controlled, and she showed appropriate signs of fatigue without the exhaustion that was evident in some of the other candidates. Most importantly, her performance had been consistent with her cover identity while demonstrating the basic fitness required to continue in the program. As the candidates gathered around the results board, Sarah listened to the conversations swirling around her. Several men had failed to meet the minimum standards and would be leaving the program before it officially began. Others had performed well enough to continue but were already showing signs of the physical stress that would only increase as the training progressed. "Wilson," Senior Chief Williams called out, his voice cutting through the chatter. "Report to my office in 10 minutes. Sarah felt a momentary spike of concern. Had her performance been too good or too poor? Had someone recognized something that didn't fit her cover story? She nodded acknowledgement and began walking toward the training office, her mind racing through possible explanations for the summons. The other candidates watched her go with expressions ranging from sympathy to relief. In their experience, being called to the senior instructor's office early in training was rarely a positive development. Jake Morrison actually smirked as she passed, clearly assuming that the female candidate was about to be dropped from the program. The training office was located in a single-story building that had seen decades of use by SEAL candidates and instructors. The walls were covered with photographs of graduating classes, mission patches, and the kind of memorabilia that accumulated around elite military units. Sarah knocked on the door marked Senior Chief Williams and waited for permission to enter. "Come in," came the familiar voice from inside. Sarah opened the door and stepped into an office that was surprisingly Spartan given Williams's long career and impressive reputation. A simple desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet, and a small bookshelf filled with military manuals comprised the entire furnishing. The walls held only a few personal items, a photograph of a SEAL team, several commendation certificates, and a flag that had clearly seen deployment overseas. Williams looked up from the paperwork spread across his desk and studied Sarah with the same intensity he had shown during the morning formation. His expression revealed nothing about his thoughts or the purpose of the meeting. After a long moment, he gestured toward one of the chairs facing his desk. "Sit down, Wilson," he said, his tone professional but not unfriendly. Sarah took the offered seat and waited, knowing that speaking first in this situation would be a mistake. Williams continued reviewing the papers on his desk for another minute before looking up and making direct eye contact. "Your test results are interesting," he said finally. "Solid performance across all events. Nothing exceptional, but nothing deficient either. Exactly what I would expect from someone who had done their homework but wasn't trying to show off." Sarah maintained her neutral expression while her mind raced. There was something in Williams's tone that suggested he was leading toward a specific point, but she couldn't determine what it might be. "Tell me about your background," Williams continued. "Hospital corpsman, right? For years active duty, then college for physical therapy." "Yes, Senior Chief," Sarah replied, sticking to her prepared cover story. "I served with a Marine unit in Afghanistan, mainly working with casualties from IED attacks and small arms engagements. After my enlistment ended, I used the GI Bill to get my degree." "And now you want to be a SEAL?" Williams asked, his tone suggesting mild curiosity rather than skepticism. "Yes, Senior Chief. My time with the Marines showed me what special operations troops could accomplish, and I want to be part of that capability." Williams nodded slowly, as if considering her response. "You understand that this training is designed to break people? That we're going to push you harder than anything you experienced as a corpsman?" "I understand, Senior Chief. Do you?" Williams leaned back in his chair and studied her face carefully. "Because I've seen a lot of people who thought they understood what they were getting into. Most of them rang that bell before the end of the first week." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I'm not most people, Senior Chief." The alarm clock's harsh buzzing cut through the pre-dawn darkness at 0430. Though Sarah had been awake for the past 20 minutes, her internal clock finely tuned from years of military service. Around her, the other candidates stirred in their bunks with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Jake Morrison groaned audibly as he swung his legs over the side of his bed, while Tommy Rodriguez was already moving with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to early morning routines. "Rise and shine, princess," Jake muttered in Sarah's direction as he stumbled toward the shared bathroom. "Time to see if yesterday was just beginner's luck." Sarah ignored the comment and began her own morning routine, moving quietly and efficiently to avoid drawing attention. She had learned during her years of undercover work that the morning hours often revealed the most about people's true character, as fatigue and stress stripped away the facades that most people maintained during daylight hours. The fourth member of their room, Marcus Chun, no relation despite sharing Sarah's cover surname, was a former Air Force pararescueman who moved with the kind of deliberate precision that came from extensive special operations training. He had been polite but distant during their brief interactions the previous evening, and Sarah suspected he was conducting his own assessments of his roommates' capabilities. By 0450, the 4 roommates had completed their morning preparations and were moving toward the designated formation area along with candidates from the other rooms. The base was still dark except for the pools of light created by strategically placed floodlights, and the morning air carried the salt smell of the nearby Pacific Ocean mixed with the diesel fumes from military vehicles already beginning their daily routines. Senior Chief Williams was waiting at the formation area along with a team of instructors who looked like they had been awake for hours. Their uniforms were crisp, and their equipment was perfectly arranged, creating an immediate contrast with the slightly disheveled appearance of the newly awakened candidates. Sarah noticed that Williams was holding a clipboard and studying each candidate as they arrived, his experienced eyes cataloging details that would be useful during the day's training. "Fall in," Williams commanded, his voice carrying easily across the formation area despite the early hour. The candidates scrambled to form 3 ranks, their movements still slightly clumsy as they adjusted to the military precision that would be expected throughout their training. Sarah positioned herself in the 2nd rank, where she would be visible to the instructors, but not prominent enough to draw unwanted attention. "Good morning, candidates," Williams announced once the formation had settled into an approximation of military bearing. "Welcome to your first day of actual training. Yesterday was just a screening test to ensure you met the minimum standards to be here. Today we begin the process of determining who has what it takes to earn the SEAL Trident." He paused and let his gaze sweep across the formation, making brief eye contact with several candidates before continuing. "This morning you will participate in your first physical training session, followed by a combat conditioning course, water survival training, and an introduction to small unit tactics. Some of you will discover that yesterday's test was the easy part." Sarah felt the familiar pre-mission tension beginning to build in her stomach, though she carefully kept her expression neutral. She had participated in training exercises throughout her career, but this was different. She was not here as an observer or evaluator. She was a participant who would be judged by the same standards as every other candidate. "Your first evolution is a 4-mile run," Williams continued. "You will maintain formation and cadence throughout. Anyone who falls out of formation will be dropped from the program immediately. Anyone who fails to maintain the required pace will be dropped from the program immediately. Are there any questions?" The formation remained silent, though Sarah noticed several candidates shifting nervously. A 4-mile formation run was significantly more challenging than the individual time trial they had completed the previous day, requiring not only individual fitness, but also the ability to work as part of a team under stress. "Outstanding," Williams said, though his tone suggested he had expected no questions. "You have 2 minutes to prepare yourselves. Formation run begins in 2 minutes." The candidates broke formation and began their final preparations, some stretching while others adjusted their equipment. Sarah noticed that Jake Morrison was bouncing on his toes and flexing his shoulders, clearly trying to psych himself up for what he probably saw as an opportunity to demonstrate his superior fitness. Tommy Rodriguez was more subdued but equally focused, his Marine Corps background evident in his systematic approach to preparation. "This is where we separate the men from the boys," Jake announced loudly enough for most of the formation to hear. "Hope everyone had their Wheaties this morning." His comment drew a few nervous chuckles, but most of the candidates remained focused on their own preparations. Sarah used the time to check her bootlaces and adjust her uniform, making sure nothing would distract her during the run. She had completed countless formation runs during her career, but never while maintaining a cover identity that required her to hide her true capabilities. "Fall in," Williams commanded, and the candidates quickly reformed their 3-rank formation. The lead instructor positioned himself at the front of the formation, while 2 additional instructors took positions on the flanks where they could monitor the candidates throughout the run. Williams moved to a position where he could observe the entire formation, his experienced eye already identifying the candidates who were showing signs of pre-exercise nervousness. "Forward march," called the lead instructor, and the formation began moving at a steady walking pace. The first few minutes were deceptively easy as the formation moved along the well-maintained roads that crisscrossed the naval base. The pace was comfortable, and the candidates began to settle into a rhythm that felt sustainable. Sarah positioned herself in the middle of the formation, matching the cadence while carefully observing the instructor's positions and behavior patterns. "Double time, march," came the command, and the formation smoothly transitioned from a walk to a run. The change in pace immediately revealed differences in the candidates' running abilities and experience with formation movement. Some struggled to maintain proper spacing, while others fought to match the cadence that was being set by the lead instructor. Sarah found herself running beside David Park, the former Army medic whose steady performance during the screening test had impressed her. The first mile passed without major incident, though Sarah could already see signs of stress beginning to appear in some of the candidates. A few were breathing more heavily than the pace warranted, suggesting that nerves were affecting their efficiency. Others were focusing so intently on maintaining formation that they were creating unnecessary tension in their running form. Jake Morrison was running in the front rank, his position allowing him to set pace for those behind him. Sarah could see that he was pushing slightly harder than necessary, probably hoping to make the run more difficult for the candidates he viewed as weaker. His breathing was still controlled, but his form showed the subtle signs of someone who was working closer to his maximum capacity than was wise for a long-distance effort. As they approached the 2-mile mark, the formation passed through a more challenging section of the route that included several hills and turns. The lead instructor maintained the same cadence despite the changing terrain, forcing the candidates to adjust their effort levels to maintain formation integrity. This was where formation running became truly difficult, the need to stay with the group regardless of individual preferences or capabilities. Sarah noticed that Tommy Rodriguez was beginning to show signs of the aggressive early pace that Jake Morrison had been setting. The large Marine was still running strongly, but his breathing had become more labored, and his form was showing subtle signs of deterioration. Behind him, several other candidates were struggling more obviously, their faces showing the strain of trying to maintain a pace that was challenging their individual limits. The 3rd mile brought more obvious signs of distress throughout the formation. 2 candidates had already fallen significantly behind despite the increasingly loud encouragement from the flanking instructors. Sarah could see that they were fighting a losing battle against fatigue and would likely be dropped from the program before the run was completed. "Stay with the formation," shouted one of the instructors to a candidate who was beginning to lose contact with the main group. "If you fall out, you're done." The psychological pressure of that threat was as challenging as the physical demands of the run itself. Every candidate knew that falling behind meant immediate dismissal from the program, adding mental stress to what was already a significant physical challenge. Sarah could see the effect in the determined expressions around her as candidates pushed themselves beyond their comfort zones to avoid elimination. David Park was still running steadily beside her, though his breathing had become more noticeable and his form was showing signs of fatigue. Sarah matched his pace while monitoring her own condition, making sure she appeared to be working at the same level as the candidates around her while actually operating well within her capabilities. As they began the 4th and final mile, the formation had stretched out considerably despite the instructor's efforts to maintain cohesion. Jake Morrison was still in the lead, but his earlier aggressive pace was beginning to exact its toll. His breathing had become labored, and his running form was noticeably less efficient than it had been during the early stages of the run. "Come on, Wilson," he called over his shoulder, his voice strained with effort. "Don't let us down now." Sarah didn't respond verbally, but she noted the comment as another example of the psychological games that were likely to continue throughout the training. Jake was clearly struggling more than he wanted to admit, and his comment was probably designed to deflect attention from his own difficulties while maintaining his image as the group's dominant performer. The final half-mile included a significant uphill section that tested every candidate's remaining energy reserves. Sarah could see several candidates beginning to show serious signs of distress, their form deteriorating rapidly as they fought to maintain contact with the formation. The instructors were maintaining their positions and cadence with apparent ease, their own fitness levels far superior to even the best candidates. "Last hill, ladies," shouted the lead instructor, his voice carrying easily despite the fact that he showed no signs of exertion from the 4-mile run. "This is where we find out who wants it." The hill was steep enough to force significant changes in running technique and effort level. Sarah adjusted her stride and body position automatically, drawing on years of experience with varied terrain while being careful not to demonstrate obviously superior technique. Around her, the other candidates were struggling with the demands of the hill, some leaning too far forward while others tried to maintain their flat ground form despite the changed conditions. Jake Morrison's earlier pace was now clearly taking its toll as he fought to maintain his position at the front of the formation. His breathing had become harsh and irregular, and his form showed the kind of deterioration that typically preceded complete exhaustion. Tommy Rodriguez had moved up slightly in the formation as Jake's pace began to falter, the Marine's superior conditioning beginning to show despite his earlier struggles. As they crested the hill and began the final descent toward the finish line, Sarah could see the training compound spread out below them in the growing morning light. The brass bell that would end any candidate's training was clearly visible, as were the instructors and staff members who had gathered to observe the conclusion of the formation run. The descent should have been easier, but several candidates were showing signs of the kind of fatigue that made even downhill running difficult. Their legs were clearly struggling to absorb the impact forces, and their coordination was becoming compromised by the sustained effort of the past 4 miles. Sarah adjusted her technique to match the struggling candidates around her while maintaining the formation spacing that the instructors demanded. "Final quarter mile," announced the lead instructor. "Everyone stays with the formation." This was the critical moment when individual pride and competitive instincts had to be subordinated to team requirements. Sarah could see several candidates who clearly had energy reserves remaining but were forced to maintain the pace of the struggling group members. Others were pushing beyond their individual limits to avoid being the weak link that dragged down the entire formation. Jake Morrison was now visibly struggling, his earlier confidence replaced by the grim determination of someone who was operating on willpower rather than physical capability. Sweat was streaming down his face despite the cool morning air, and his breathing had become so labored that it was audible to candidates running several yards away. The final 100 yards brought the formation past groups of base personnel who had stopped their morning routines to watch the SEAL candidates complete their first major training evolution. Some called out encouragement, while others simply observed with the kind of professional interest that came from understanding exactly how difficult the training program was. "Hold formation," commanded the lead instructor as they approached the finish line. "Nobody breaks formation until I give the command." The formation crossed the finish line as a group, though several candidates immediately showed signs of complete exhaustion. Jake Morrison bent over with his hands on his knees, breathing so hard that Sarah was genuinely concerned he might collapse. Tommy Rodriguez was in better condition, but clearly relieved to have completed the run without being dropped from the program. "Formation, halt," came the command, and the candidates came to a ragged stop near the training compound entrance. Sarah stood at attention with the others while trying to match their apparent level of fatigue. Her own breathing was elevated but controlled, and her legs felt strong despite the 4-mile effort. She forced herself to show more signs of exertion than she actually felt, adding a slight tremor to her stance and allowing her breathing to become more obvious. Senior Chief Williams moved through the formation, making brief eye contact with each candidate while assessing their condition. When he reached Sarah, his gaze lingered for just a moment longer than seemed necessary, but his expression revealed nothing about his thoughts. "Not bad for a first effort," Williams announced to the formation. 3 candidates failed to maintain formation and have been dropped from the program. The rest of you have earned the privilege of continuing to the next evolution. Sarah noticed that Jake Morrison was still struggling to recover from the run, though he was trying to hide his condition from the instructors. His face was pale, and his hands were still shaking slightly, classic signs of someone who had pushed significantly beyond their aerobic capacity. She wondered if his aggressive early pace had been an attempt to establish dominance or simply poor tactical judgment. "You have 15 minutes to prepare for the combat conditioning course," Williams continued. "Hydrate, check your equipment, and get your heads ready for the next challenge. Anyone who thinks that run was difficult is about to learn what difficult really means." The candidates broke formation and moved toward the water stations that had been set up near the training area. Sarah noticed that several were moving with the careful steps of people whose legs were not entirely trustworthy after the sustained effort. She made sure her own movement showed appropriate signs of fatigue while internally assessing the challenges that lay ahead. The combat conditioning course was visible from their current position, a complex obstacle course that included rope climbs, wall traversals, crawling sections, and various strength challenges designed to test both physical capability and mental determination. Sarah had trained on similar courses throughout her career, but she would need to be careful not to demonstrate the advanced techniques that came from her special operations background. "Hey, Wilson," David Park called out as they reached the water station. "Nice job staying with the formation. I wasn't sure you'd make it up that last hill." "Thanks," Sarah replied, accepting the implied compliment while noting that David's assessment suggested her performance had been convincing. That was harder than I expected. It's only going to get worse, Tommy Rodriguez added, having overheard their conversation. The instructors are just getting warmed up. Jake Morrison approached the group, moving more slowly than his usual aggressive pace, and still showing signs of his difficult recovery from the run. His face had regained some color, but his breathing remained slightly elevated, and his confidence seemed shaken by the realization that his superior fitness might not be as overwhelming as he had assumed. Good thing that wasn't timed individually, he said, clearly trying to regain some of his earlier swagger. I was holding back so everyone could keep up with the formation. The comment drew skeptical looks from the other candidates, who had observed his obvious distress during the final miles of the run. Sarah said nothing, but she filed away the information for future reference. Jake's need to maintain his image as the dominant performer might lead him to make poor decisions during subsequent training evolutions. Listen up. Williams's voice cut through the candidates' conversations. The combat conditioning course tests your ability to function under stress while maintaining the aggressive mindset that defines special operations personnel. You will complete the course individually, and your performance will be timed. Anyone who fails to complete the course within the maximum allowable time will be dropped from the program. Sarah studied the obstacle course layout while Williams continued his briefing. The design was clearly intended to test multiple aspects of physical and mental performance, upper body strength, agility, pain tolerance, and the ability to maintain focus under pressure. She could see sections that would favor different body types and fitness backgrounds, ensuring that no single approach would guarantee success. The course begins with a 50-yard low crawl under barbed wire, Williams explained, pointing to the first obstacle. From there you will complete a rope climb, traverse the parallel bars, negotiate the wall complex, complete the tire run, and finish with another 50-yard low crawl. Your time starts when you enter the course and stops when you cross the finish line. The first candidate to attempt the course was a former college wrestler named Steve Martinez, whose compact, powerful build seemed well suited to the challenges ahead. Sarah watched carefully as he moved through the obstacles, noting his techniques and identifying areas where her own approach would need to be modified to match her cover identity. Martinez completed the low crawl efficiently, but not expertly, his technique adequate, but showing room for improvement. His rope climbing was strong and direct, benefiting from his wrestling background and upper body development. The parallel bars challenged his grip strength and coordination, but he managed to complete the traverse without falling. The wall complex was where Martinez encountered his first serious difficulty. The obstacles required not just strength, but also technique and problem-solving ability under pressure. Sarah could see him struggling to find efficient approaches to several challenges, losing valuable time as he worked through solutions that should have been more intuitive. His time at the finish line was adequate, but not impressive, placing him in the middle range of what would likely be acceptable performance. As he completed the course, Sarah could see the fatigue and stress that the obstacles had created, confirming her assessment that this evolution would be significantly more demanding than the morning run. Jake Morrison was the third candidate to attempt the course, and Sarah watched with interest to see how his earlier difficulties during the run might affect his performance on a different type of challenge. His approach to the low crawl was aggressive and direct, though his technique was more about power than efficiency. The rope climb suited his upper body strength, and he completed it with impressive speed despite showing signs of fatigue from the morning's activities. His performance on the parallel bars was similarly strong, though Sarah noticed that his grip was beginning to show the effects of accumulated stress. The wall complex was where Jake's earlier exertion began to exact its toll. His movements were still powerful, but his decision-making was becoming less precise, and his technique was showing the kind of deterioration that came from operating on willpower rather than reserves. He completed the obstacles, but lost significant time on sections that should have been more straightforward. His final low crawl was visibly labored, and his finishing time reflected the cumulative effect of pushing too hard during the early stages of the day's training. As he crossed the finish line, his condition was clearly compromised, and Sarah wondered if he was beginning to understand that successful completion of SEAL training required tactical intelligence as well as raw physical ability. When her turn came, Sarah approached the course with the same measured confidence she had displayed during the previous day's testing. Her strategy was to complete each obstacle efficiently without demonstrating the advanced techniques that would reveal her true background. She had practiced extensively to develop approaches that would be effective but not obviously superior. The low crawl under barbed wire was a test of mental toughness as much as physical technique. The wire was positioned low enough to force candidates into genuinely uncomfortable positions while moving across rough, sandy ground that abraded exposed skin and filled clothing with grit. Sarah moved steadily and efficiently, keeping her profile low while maintaining forward progress at a sustainable pace. Her technique was good, but not exceptional, drawing on her experience while avoiding the obviously advanced approaches that would have cut significant time from her performance. She emerged from the crawl section with appropriate signs of discomfort, but without the obvious distress that had affected some of the other candidates. The rope climb was potentially more problematic, as her technique was significantly superior to what would be expected from her background. She had spent hours practicing a modified approach that would be effective but not expertly efficient. Her climb was smooth and steady, but she deliberately avoided some of the advanced techniques that would have made the ascent much faster. The parallel bars tested upper body strength and grip endurance while requiring the kind of coordination that came from extensive training. Sarah moved across the bars with controlled efficiency, her technique solid but not obviously expert. She could feel the accumulated fatigue from the morning's activities beginning to affect her performance, though her condition remained far superior to most of the other candidates. The wall complex presented the greatest challenge to maintaining her cover, as her natural inclination was to use advanced climbing and traversal techniques that would dramatically reduce her completion time. Instead, she forced herself to work through each obstacle with the kind of problem-solving approach that would be expected from someone with limited specialized training. Her solutions were effective but not elegant, and she allowed herself to show appropriate signs of struggle while still maintaining forward progress. The time she lost on these obstacles was frustrating from a performance standpoint, but necessary to maintain the illusion that she was simply a determined candidate with adequate preparation rather than someone with extensive special operations experience. The final low crawl was completed with the same steady approach she had used for the first, though she allowed more obvious signs of fatigue to show as she neared the finish line. Her breathing was elevated and her movements were showing the effects of the sustained effort, though her condition remained better than most of the candidates who had completed the course before her. Her finishing time was in the middle range of the group, good enough to avoid attention, but not fast enough to suggest exceptional ability. As she crossed the finish line, she forced herself to show appropriate signs of exhaustion while internally assessing her performance and planning for the challenges that lay ahead. "Nice job, Wilson," David Park called out as she completed the course. "You made that look easier than it felt when I did it." "Thanks," Sarah replied, though she wondered if her performance had been too smooth despite her efforts to appear appropriately challenged. "My legs are feeling it now." Senior Chief Williams was recording times and making notes on his clipboard as each candidate finished the course. When Sarah passed by his position, he made brief eye contact but offered no comment on her performance. His expression was unreadable, but she had the uncomfortable feeling that he was beginning to notice patterns that didn't entirely fit her cover story. The remaining candidates completed the course with varying degrees of success, and 2 more were dropped from the program for failing to meet the minimum time standards. As the survivors gathered near the equipment area to prepare for the next evolution, Sarah noticed that the group dynamic was beginning to shift as the stress of training revealed more about each person's true character and capabilities. Jake Morrison was clearly struggling more than he had expected, though he was still trying to maintain his image as the group's alpha male. Tommy Rodriguez was performing consistently well, but showing the effects of accumulated fatigue. David Park was proving to be steady and reliable, though not exceptional in any particular area. The morning's training had already begun the process of separating those who would ultimately succeed from those who would eventually ring the bell and leave the program. Sarah knew that the real challenges were still ahead, and that maintaining her cover while gathering the intelligence her mission required would only become more difficult as the training intensified and the remaining candidates were pushed closer to their breaking points. For the afternoon, water survival training took place at the base's specialized aquatic facility, where multiple pools of varying depths and temperatures had been constructed to simulate the challenging maritime environments that SEALs routinely operated in. Sarah arrived at the pool complex along with the remaining candidates, noting the serious expressions on the instructors' faces and the array of specialized equipment positioned around the training area. The facility itself was impressive, Olympic-sized pools connected to smaller training areas designed for specific skill development, along with deeper sections where candidates would learn to operate in the kind of three-dimensional environment that defined underwater combat operations. Sarah had trained in similar facilities throughout her career, but she had never done so while maintaining a cover identity that required her to hide her extensive underwater expertise. Water survival and combat swimming are core competencies for naval special warfare personnel, announced Petty Officer Rodriguez, the lead swimming instructor whose own SEAL trident and multiple deployment patches marked him as a veteran operator. You will spend the next 4 hours learning techniques that could save your life during real-world operations. Some of you will discover that being comfortable in a swimming pool does not translate to competence in tactical water operations. The first evolution involved treading water while wearing full combat equipment including boots, uniform, and a weighted vest that simulated combat gear. Sarah watched as the first group of candidates entered the water, their movements immediately becoming labored as the added weight and clothing restricted their normal swimming ability. Jake Morrison was in the first group, and Sarah could see his confidence beginning to return as he demonstrated the kind of raw strength and endurance that served him well in water-based challenges. His technique was not particularly refined, but his physical conditioning allowed him to maintain his position in the water through pure effort and determination. Tommy Rodriguez was struggling more than expected, his large frame working against him in the water despite his excellent overall conditioning. The Marines' training had focused heavily on land-based operations, and his swimming background was clearly more limited than some of the other candidates. Sarah could see him fighting to maintain his position while burning energy at an unsustainable rate. When her turn came, Sarah entered the water with the deliberate movements of someone who was competent, but not exceptional in aquatic environments. She had spent considerable time practicing techniques that would allow her to perform well without demonstrating the advanced capabilities that came from her specialized training. The weighted vest and combat clothing immediately created the kind of drag and restriction that challenged even experienced swimmers, but Sarah had trained extensively in similar conditions throughout her career. She found herself treading water beside David Park, whose steady approach to previous challenges was serving him well in this new environment. "This sucks," David muttered as he worked to maintain his position in the water. His breathing was becoming labored, and Sarah could see that he was struggling with the psychological challenge of being in deep water while wearing equipment that made sinking a very real possibility. "Just focus on small movements," Sarah suggested, offering advice that would be appropriate from her cover identity. "Big movements just waste energy." Her technique was efficient, but not obviously expert, drawing on her experience while avoiding the advanced approaches that would have made the evolution much easier. She could feel the accumulated fatigue from the morning's training beginning to affect her performance, though her condition remained significantly better than most of the other candidates. The 30-minute treading water evolution pushed several candidates to their limits, and one was pulled from the water by the safety divers when his technique deteriorated to the point where he was clearly in distress. The psychological pressure of operating in deep water while wearing restrictive equipment was as challenging as the physical demands, and Sarah could see the stress beginning to show in the expressions around her. "Time," called Petty Officer Rodriguez, and the candidates were allowed to exit the water and prepare for the next evolution. Sarah climbed out of the pool with appropriate signs of exertion, her breathing elevated and her movements showing the effects of the sustained effort. She noticed that Jake Morrison was recovering more quickly than some of the other candidates, his natural affinity for water-based challenges giving him an advantage over the land-focused athletes in the group. The next evolution involved swimming underwater distances while holding their breath, a skill that was fundamental to many SEAL operations, but which required both physical conditioning and mental discipline. The candidates gathered around a deeper section of the pool while the instructors explained the requirements and safety procedures. You will swim underwater for maximum distance on a single breath, Rodriguez explained. The minimum standard is 50 meters. Anyone who fails to achieve this distance will be dropped from the program immediately. Safety divers will be positioned throughout the pool, but they will only intervene if you are in genuine distress. Sarah felt a familiar spike of concern as she listened to the briefing. Underwater swimming had always been one of her strongest areas, and her natural ability was far superior to what would be expected from her background. She had practiced extensively to develop a technique that would meet the standards without revealing her true capabilities, but this evolution would be her greatest challenge yet. The first candidate to attempt the underwater swim was Marcus Chun, the former Air Force pararescueman whose special operations background had made him one of the more competent performers throughout the day's training. Sarah watched carefully as he prepared himself at the pool edge, noting his breathing patterns and mental preparation techniques. Marcus's dive was clean and his underwater technique was efficient, reflecting his previous training and natural ability in aquatic environments. He swam with smooth, powerful strokes that conserved oxygen while maintaining good forward progress. Sarah could see him counting strokes to track his distance while monitoring his own condition for signs that he was approaching his physiological limits. He surfaced at the 70-meter mark, well above the minimum standard and clearly still in control of his faculties. His breathing was labored but not distressed, and his technique remained smooth through the finish. As he climbed from the pool, Sarah noted that his performance had been competent, but not exceptional, exactly the kind of result she needed to achieve. Jake Morrison's attempt was characteristically aggressive, his approach reflecting his belief that superior physical conditioning could overcome any technical deficiencies. His dive was powerful but not particularly efficient, and his underwater technique was more about force than finesse. Sarah could see him swimming hard from the beginning, his stroke rate higher than optimal for oxygen conservation. His natural strength and lung capacity carried him past the minimum standard, but his technique suggested he was working much harder than necessary to achieve his result. He surfaced at the 60-meter mark, breathing heavily and showing signs of real physiological stress from his effort. His aggressive approach had been successful but inefficient, and Sarah wondered if he was beginning to understand that technique and tactical intelligence were as important as raw physical ability in special operations training. When her turn came, Sarah positioned herself at the pool edge and began the breathing pattern that would prepare her for the underwater swim. She had to be careful not to demonstrate the advanced preparation techniques that came from her specialized training, but she could use basic approaches that would be available to anyone with swimming experience. Her dive was clean but unremarkable, designed to get her underwater efficiently without revealing the expert technique that would have given her significant advantage. Once underwater, she began swimming with the steady, efficient stroke pattern that she had practiced extensively for this moment. The underwater environment was peaceful compared to the chaos of the surface training evolutions, and Sarah found herself automatically settling into the meditative state that came with extended breath holding. She had to resist the temptation to push for maximum distance, instead focusing on swimming just far enough to demonstrate adequate capability without revealing her true potential. The pool's underwater markers helped her track her progress as she swam past the minimum 50-meter requirement. Her oxygen consumption was well within sustainable limits, and her stroke technique was maintaining good efficiency despite the need to appear less expert than she actually was. At the 65-meter mark, she made the decision to surface, allowing herself to show appropriate signs of oxygen depletion while still demonstrating solid performance. Her surfacing technique was controlled, and her breathing showed the elevated rate that would be expected from someone who had pushed close to their limits. "Good swim, Wilson," Petty Officer Rodriguez called out as she reached the pool edge. His tone was professionally neutral, but Sarah thought she detected a slight note of approval in his assessment. As she climbed from the pool, Sarah noticed that Senior Chief Williams was observing the evolution from a position near the diving boards. His attention seemed focused on her, and She wondered if her performance had been too smooth or if he was simply monitoring all candidates equally carefully. The underwater swimming evolution continued with the remaining candidates, and 2 more were dropped from the program for failing to meet the minimum distance requirement. The psychological pressure of the underwater environment was clearly affecting some candidates more than others, and Sarah could see the stress beginning to accumulate as the group size continued to decrease. David Park completed the swim at exactly the minimum distance, surfacing with obvious distress, but managing to meet the standard. His technique was adequate, but clearly reflected limited underwater experience, and his recovery time suggested he had pushed very close to his physiological limits. That was harder than I expected, he admitted as Sarah helped him from the pool. I kept thinking about what would happen if I didn't make the distance. The mental part is the hardest, Sarah agreed, offering support that would be appropriate from her cover identity. Once you start thinking about failing, it's hard to focus on technique. The afternoon's training concluded with an introduction to combat swimming techniques that would form the foundation for more advanced underwater operations. The candidates learned basic approaches to swimming while carrying equipment, moving silently through water, and coordinating with other swimmers during tactical operations. Sarah participated in these evolutions with the same measured approach she had used throughout the day, performing competently while avoiding any demonstration of advanced capabilities. The techniques being taught were fundamental versions of skills she had mastered years earlier, but she forced herself to act as if she was learning them for the first time. As the candidates prepared to leave the pool facility, Sarah noticed that the group dynamics were continuing to evolve under the pressure of training. Jake Morrison was still trying to maintain his position as the group's dominant performer, but his earlier struggles were beginning to affect his confidence and his interactions with the other candidates. Tommy Rodriguez had performed adequately but not exceptionally during the water training, and his quiet demeanor suggested he was beginning to realize that his Marine Corps background had not prepared him for all aspects of SEAL training. David Park was proving to be steady and reliable despite not excelling in any particular area. The evening hours were designated for equipment maintenance and personal time, but Sarah knew that the informal interactions during these periods were often as important as the formal training evolutions. She needed to continue building relationships with the other candidates while gathering intelligence about their attitudes and behaviors. "Hey Wilson," Jake Morrison called out as they walked back toward the candidate quarters. "Want to grab some chow with us? We're going to talk about what we think is coming next." The invitation surprised Sarah, as Jake's previous interactions with her had been dismissive or condescending. She wondered if his attitude was changing as the training revealed that her performance was consistently solid, or if this was some kind of test designed to evaluate her social integration with the group. "Sure," she replied, maintaining the friendly but reserved demeanor that she had established as part of her cover identity. "I could use some food after all that swimming." The base dining facility was busy with personnel from various units, creating a background of conversation and activity that provided good cover for private discussions. Sarah followed Jake and the other candidates to a table in a corner where they could talk without being easily overheard. "So what do you guys think?" Jake asked once they had settled with their meals. "Are the instructors trying to wash out as many people as possible, or are they looking for specific qualities?" "Both," Tommy Rodriguez replied immediately. "They're definitely looking to cut numbers, but they're also evaluating how we handle pressure and whether we can adapt to new challenges." David Park nodded in agreement. "The physical standards are just the baseline. They want to see how we think under stress and whether we can work as part of a team." Sarah listened carefully to the conversation while eating, noting the different perspectives and trying to assess how much of each candidate's analysis was accurate. Her own experience suggested that Tommy's assessment was closest to the truth, but she couldn't share that knowledge without revealing more about her background than was safe. "What about you, Wilson?" Jake asked, turning his attention to her. "You've been pretty quiet today, but you're keeping up with everything they're throwing at us." The question felt like a test, and Sarah chose her words carefully. "I think they're trying to see how we handle uncertainty. Every evolution has been different, so we can't just rely on being good at one particular thing." "That's a good point," Marcus Chin said, speaking for the first time during the conversation. "The physical requirements are tough, but The mental challenges are what's really separating people. Sarah noted that Marcus's comment suggested he was also thinking tactically about the training process, which was consistent with his special operations background. She wondered how much of his own capabilities he was concealing and whether he had noticed anything about her performance that didn't fit her cover story. The conversation continued for another hour, covering topics ranging from predictions about upcoming training to personal backgrounds and motivations for attempting SEAL training. Sarah participated naturally while being careful not to reveal any details that might compromise her cover identity. As they prepared to return to their quarters for the evening, Jake Morrison pulled her aside for a private conversation. His demeanor was more serious than she had seen previously, and Sarah wondered what had prompted this change in his attitude toward her. "Listen, Wilson," he said, his voice lower than usual. "I wanted to apologize for some of the comments I made yesterday. I was being an ass, and you didn't deserve that." The apology surprised Sarah, both because it was unexpected and because it seemed genuine. "Thanks," she replied simply, not sure how much elaboration would be appropriate. "The thing is," Jake continued, "I've been thinking about how today went, and I realized I might have been approaching this all wrong. I was trying to prove I was the strongest guy here, but that's not really what they're looking for, is it?" Sarah considered her response carefully. Jake's self-awareness suggested that he was capable of learning and adapting, which might make him a more formidable candidate than his earlier performance had indicated. It also suggested that her own approach of steady competence without showboating was having the intended effect. "I think they want to see that we can do whatever the mission requires," she said finally. "Sometimes that means being the strongest or fastest, but sometimes it means knowing when to hold back and work with the team." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, I think you're right. I've been so focused on proving myself that I wasn't really thinking about the bigger picture." As they walked back to their quarters, Sarah reflected on the day's events and the intelligence she was gathering about the training environment and candidate behavior. Jake's attitude shift was interesting and potentially significant for her assessment of how the program affected individual development and group dynamics. The evening routine in the candidate quarters was subdued compared to the previous night, with most candidates focusing on equipment maintenance and personal preparation for the next day's challenges. Sarah used the time to review her mental notes about each candidate's performance and behavior patterns while maintaining her cover as someone who was simply trying to survive the training. Tommy Rodriguez was cleaning his equipment with the methodical precision that reflected his military background, while David Park was studying training materials and taking notes about techniques they had learned during the day. Marcus Chun was maintaining his equipment efficiently but quietly, his actions suggesting he was comfortable with military routines but not interested in drawing attention to himself. Jake Morrison was also maintaining his equipment, but Sarah noticed that his approach was less systematic than it had been the previous evening. His conversation with her seemed to have prompted some introspection about his performance and approach to the training. As the lights went out and the candidates settled into their bunks for the night, Sarah found herself thinking about the challenges that lay ahead. The first day of actual training had revealed significant information about the program's methods and the candidates' responses to pressure, but she knew that the most difficult evolutions were still coming. The water training had been particularly challenging from a cover maintenance perspective, as her natural abilities in aquatic environments were far superior to what her background should have provided. She had managed to perform adequately without revealing her true capabilities, but she wondered how long she could maintain that balance as the training became more specialized and demanding. Her conversation with Jake Morrison had also been informative, both because it revealed something about his character and because it suggested that her own performance was being noticed and evaluated by the other candidates. She would need to be even more careful about maintaining consistency in her cover story as relationships within the group continued to develop. The morning alarm would come early, and Sarah knew that the second day of training would bring new challenges and new opportunities to gather intelligence about the program's effectiveness and cultural environment. She had successfully navigated the first day while maintaining her cover, but the real test of her abilities was still ahead. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah could hear the quiet breathing of her roommates and the distant sounds of base operations continuing through the night. Tomorrow would bring new evolutions, new pressure, and new tests of her ability to balance her mission requirements with the need to successfully complete one of the most demanding training programs in the world. The brass bell near the training office remained silent in the darkness, waiting for the next candidate to decide that the pressure had become too much to bear. Sarah was determined that her name would not be associated with that bell, regardless of how difficult it became to maintain her cover while gathering the intelligence that her superiors required. The second day of training would test not only her physical capabilities, but also her ability to continue building relationships with the other candidates while avoiding detection as an undercover evaluator. The stakes were high, both for her mission and for the future of the SEAL program's approach to training and candidate evaluation. She closed her eyes and focused on the mental preparation techniques that had served her throughout her career, knowing that tomorrow would require all of her skills and experience to navigate successfully. The training was just beginning, and the most challenging evolutions lay ahead for both the candidates and the undercover Admiral who was evaluating their every move. The fourth week of training brought the candidates to Hell Week, the notorious 5 a half-day evolution that served as the ultimate test of mental toughness and determination in SEAL training. Sarah had been dreading this period not because of the physical challenges, which she was confident she could handle, but because the extended stress and sleep deprivation would make maintaining her cover exponentially more difficult. The week began on Sunday evening with the traditional breakout, a chaotic initiation that involved instructors using simulated explosions, loud music, and constant physical activity to immediately establish the intense atmosphere that would define the next 5 days. Sarah found herself thrown into a world of surf torture, log carrying, and nonstop physical evolutions that pushed every candidate to their absolute limits. By Tuesday morning, the original class of 60 candidates had been reduced to 22, with the brass bell claiming victim after victim as the relentless pressure mounted. Sarah had managed to maintain her cover through sheer determination and careful energy management, but she could feel the strain beginning to affect her judgment and reaction times. The remaining candidates looked like survivors of a natural disaster, sand-covered, exhausted, and operating on levels of sleep deprivation that would have been considered torture in other contexts. Jake Morrison had surprised everyone by adapting well to the mental challenges of Hell Week, his earlier attitude problems replaced by a grim focus that made him one of the more reliable performers in the group. Tommy Rodriguez had not been as fortunate. The large Marine's excellent physical conditioning had carried him through the first few days, but his lack of water experience had finally caught up with him during a night surf passage evolution. He had rung the bell early Tuesday morning, joining the growing list of candidates who had discovered that wanting to be a SEAL was not the same as being able to endure what it took to become one. David Park was still in the program, though barely. His steady, methodical approach to challenges had served him well, but Sarah could see that he was operating very close to his breaking point. His movements were becoming increasingly mechanical, and his responses to instructor commands were showing the kind of delay that suggested his mental processing was being affected by the accumulated stress. Wilson, the voice of Instructor Martinez, cut through the pre-dawn darkness as the candidates struggled through another evolution of log carries along the beach. You and Morrison take point on the log rotation. Sarah moved forward with Jake to take the leading positions on the heavy wooden log that the team was carrying, her movements automatic despite the fatigue that seemed to have settled into her bones like a permanent condition. The log was waterlogged and covered with sand, making it both heavier and more difficult to grip than it appeared. "How you holding up?" Jake asked quietly as they settled into the rhythm of the exercise, his voice barely audible over the sound of surf, and the other candidates labored breathing. "Still here," Sarah replied, which had become the standard response among the remaining candidates. Anything more elaborate required energy that was better saved for the next evolution. The truth was that Sarah was holding up better than most of the other candidates, but she was having to work increasingly hard to hide that fact. Her specialized training and experience with sleep deprivation were giving her significant advantages, but demonstrating those advantages would compromise her cover and potentially undermine her entire mission. The log carry continued for another hour, with the candidates rotating positions every few minutes to prevent any individual from bearing the full weight for extended periods. The instructors maintained a punishing pace that forced the team to work together while testing each person's willingness to share the burden of leadership and sacrifice. Sarah found herself naturally falling into leadership roles during these evolutions, her experience with small unit tactics and team coordination making her an effective coordinator for group activities. She had to constantly remind herself to pull back and allow others to take the lead, even when she could see more efficient approaches to the challenges they were facing. Logs down, came the command, and the candidates gratefully lowered their burdens to the sand. Next evolution in 5 minutes. Hydrate and prepare for the obstacle course. The obstacle course during Hell Week was the same one they had completed during their first week of training, but running it while sleep-deprived and exhausted created an entirely different level of challenge. Sarah had watched several candidates injure themselves on obstacles they had previously completed easily, their coordination and judgment compromised by the accumulated stress. As they prepared for the course, Sarah noticed that Marcus Chun had been struggling more than expected during the past 2 days. The former Air Force pararescueman's special operations background should have prepared him well for Hell Week, but he was showing signs of the kind of psychological stress that sometimes affected experienced personnel who had specific expectations about military training. "Chun," she called quietly as they moved toward the starting line. "You okay?" Marcus looked at her with eyes that showed the 1,000-yard stare of someone who was operating on autopilot. "Yeah," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Just trying to get through this one evolution at a time." Sarah nodded understanding, but made a mental note to keep an eye on Marcus during the upcoming challenge. In her experience, the candidates who were most at risk during Hell Week were often those who appeared strong, but were actually fighting internal battles that weren't visible from the outside. The obstacle course run was timed, but the instructors had made it clear that the primary evaluation criterion was effort rather than speed. They wanted to see candidates pushing themselves despite exhaustion, demonstrating the kind of mental toughness that would be required during real-world operations when physical reserves were depleted, but missions still needed to be completed. Sarah approached each obstacle with the same measured determination she had maintained throughout Hell Week, focusing on safe completion rather than impressive performance. Her technique remained solid despite her fatigue, drawing on years of experience with similar challenges while avoiding any demonstration of obviously advanced capabilities. The rope climb was where she noticed Marcus beginning to have serious difficulties. His normally smooth technique was becoming erratic, and his grip strength was clearly compromised by the accumulated stress of the week. As she completed her own climb, Sarah could see him struggling at the halfway point, his movements becoming increasingly desperate as fatigue fought against determination. "Come on, Chun," she called out, offering encouragement that would be natural from a teammate. "You've got this. Just one move at a time." Marcus managed to complete the climb, but his time on the obstacle course was significantly slower than his previous performances. As he crossed the finish line, Sarah could see the frustration and doubt beginning to show in his expression, dangerous signs during a week when mental attitude was often more important than physical capability. The afternoon brought boat cruise, an evolution that required teams of 6 candidates to work together carrying heavy inflatable boats through surf, across beaches, and over obstacles while maintaining specific formations and responding to instructor commands. Sarah found herself assigned to a crew that included Jake Morrison, David Park, Marcus Chun, and 2 other candidates who had managed to survive the week so far. Boat crew evolutions were where teamwork became critical, as no individual could complete the challenges alone regardless of their personal fitness level. The instructors deliberately created situations where crews would succeed or fail as units, forcing candidates to put group success ahead of individual performance. "This is where we find out who's really committed to the team," Jake said as they prepared to lift their boat for the first movement. His leadership during Hell Week had been one of the positive surprises, as his earlier ego-driven behavior had been replaced by a focus on group success. The boat was heavy enough to require all 6 team members working in coordination, and the movements required precise timing to avoid injuries or equipment damage. Sarah found herself naturally coordinating the team's actions, her experience with small unit leadership making her effective at managing the complex logistics of boat movement. Wilson's got good instincts for this, David Park observed during a brief rest period. She always seems to know when we need to adjust our grip or change formation. The comment made Sarah slightly uncomfortable, as it suggested her leadership capabilities were becoming more obvious than she intended. She made a mental note to be more careful about hiding her tactical. A slight smile flickered across Williams's face before disappearing. "No," he said quietly. "I don't think you are." He returned his attention to the paperwork on his desk, and Sarah wondered if she had revealed too much in that moment. Her response had carried more confidence than might be expected from her cover identity, but it was too late to take it back now. "You're dismissed, Wilson," Williams said without looking up. "Formation at 0500 tomorrow morning. Don't be late." Sarah stood and moved toward the door, pausing when Williams spoke again. "Wilson." "Yes, Senior Chief?" "Welcome to SEAL training. Try not to let the other candidates get in your head. They're going to try." As Sarah left the office and walked back toward the candidate quarters, she reflected on the conversation. Williams was clearly more perceptive than she had hoped, and his warning about the other candidates suggested that the real challenges were just beginning. Tomorrow would bring the start of the actual training, and she would need to balance her mission requirements with the need to survive what was universally acknowledged as the most demanding military program in the world. The evening hours passed quickly as the candidates settled into their assigned quarters and prepared for the beginning of formal training. Sarah found herself assigned to a room with 3 other candidates, including Jake Morrison and Tommy Rodriguez. The accommodations were basic but adequate: 4 beds, 4 lockers, and a shared bathroom that would see heavy use during the intense training schedule ahead. As the lights went out, and the candidates tried to get what sleep they could before the 0500 formation, Sarah lay in her bunk and listened to the quiet conversations around her. Tomorrow would begin the real test of her ability to maintain her cover while gathering the intelligence her superiors needed. She had passed the first hurdle, but she knew that the most difficult challenges lay ahead.